The cold waters of the English Channel once swallowed more than a ship. They swallowed the future of a kingdom. On a dark November night in the year 1120, the white ship struck a hidden rock and went down, carrying with it the only legitimate son of King Henry I. In that single moment, England's destiny shifted. What might have been a smooth succession turned into 2 decades of turmoil that history would remember as the Anarchy. Out of the wreckage rose a woman determined to claim what was hers by right. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry, widow of a Holy Roman Emperor, and a figure both admired and feared by her contemporaries. Her story is not simply one of ambition, but of defiance in a world that refused to see a woman as sovereign. Betrayed by barons who had sworn to uphold her claim, opposed by her cousin Stephen of Blois who seized the crown, and trapped in a brutal civil war, Matilda fought with an iron will. Her path was filled with triumphs and disasters. Moments when she nearly grasped the crown, only to be forced to flee. Daring escapes that seemed almost like legend, and years of unyielding perseverance in the face of betrayal and despair. She never became queen, yet her fight changed the future of England forever, paving the way for her son Henry to found the mighty Plantagenet dynasty. This is not just the tale of a medieval succession crisis. It is the story of loyalty broken, of castles laid siege, of a people suffering while their lords shifted allegiance. And above all, it is the story of a woman ahead of her time, whose unclaimed crown still echoes through history. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video we explore the extraordinary life and legacy of Empress Matilda. Her fight, her failures, and the kingdom forever changed by her struggle. The early 12th century was a turning point in English history, and few events demonstrate this better than the sudden loss of King Henry I's only legitimate son. What followed was not simply a crisis of succession, but a deep rupture in the kingdom's stability that would sow unrest for decades. The seeds of anarchy were planted when a single disaster at sea robbed the realm of its expected heir, leaving a daughter as the next in line. What might have been a smooth transfer of power was instead marred by betrayal, broken oaths, and the unwillingness of powerful men to accept a woman as their sovereign. Henry I was a careful and pragmatic ruler. The youngest son of William the Conqueror, he inherited a realm already shaped by Norman strength, yet still unsettled by rivalries and the resistance of older English traditions. Henry consolidated authority with a combination of harsh justice and calculated diplomacy. He married Matilda of Scotland, a union that bound him to the old royal line of the English, giving legitimacy to his Norman kingship. Their marriage produced 2 legitimate children, a son named William and a daughter named Matilda. Henry also fathered many illegitimate offspring, but in the logic of medieval monarchy, only William mattered for the continuity of his line. William was raised to inherit not only England, but also Normandy, the dukedom across the Channel that bound the dynasty to its French roots. By the second decade of the 12th century, it was clear to everyone at court that the young man represented stability and strength. In an age when dynasties could crumble if a single life were lost, William's survival meant peace. But fate had other plans. In the year 1120, after a period of relative calm in the kingdom, disaster struck. Henry had been in Normandy to settle disputes with the French king, Louis VI. Once the business of the campaign was finished, the royal party prepared to return to England. The king set sail on one vessel, while his son William and many of the realm's young nobles boarded another, a newly outfitted ship called the White Ship. It was a proud, luxurious vessel, and the young nobles celebrated on board with wine and feasting before departure. As the ship set out at night, the crew and passengers were drunk, and in their carelessness the vessel struck a hidden rock not far from the Norman coast. Within moments, it was fatally damaged. The sea claimed nearly everyone on board. Among the drowned was Prince William, the only legitimate male heir to the English throne. The loss was devastating. Chroniclers describe Henry's grief as beyond words. The death of William was not just a personal tragedy, it was a catastrophe for the kingdom. The stability that had rested on his shoulders now dissolved, and all at once the future of England was uncertain. The Norman dynasty had no direct male heir. Henry had illegitimate sons, some capable and loyal, but the rules of legitimacy were strict. The only legitimate child left was Matilda, his daughter. Matilda was not an ordinary princess. She had already been married off in a prestigious union. As a young girl, she had been given to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, and in her years abroad she acquired the title of Empress. Though her husband died in 1125, Leaving her a widow with no children, she returned to her father's court in England with a stature unlike that of any other noblewoman. She was not simply a daughter of a king. She was a crowned empress, trained in the politics of one of the greatest courts of Europe. Henry looked to her as the solution to his succession crisis. The idea of a female ruler in 12th century England was unusual. No queen had yet reigned in her own right. Women could inherit land, wealth, and even titles, but the crown was a different matter. The feudal lords who dominated the kingdom expected to owe loyalty to a king who could lead them in war and defend the realm. A woman as sovereign challenged deeply rooted expectations. Yet Henry was determined. He summoned his barons and nobles and declared that Matilda would be his heir. He required them to swear an oath of loyalty to her, promising that when he died they would recognize her as queen. This was not a casual request. Henry forced these oaths upon the most powerful men of the realm, binding them in public ceremony. For a time, it seemed as though Henry's plan might hold. The barons complied, swearing fealty to Matilda. They had little choice while the king lived. Still, beneath the surface there was unease. Many were not convinced that they should ever be ruled by a woman. Some resented Matilda personally, describing her as proud and overbearing, too quick to remind others of her imperial dignity. Others feared the political implications of her marriage. After her time as empress, she was remarried to Geoffrey of Anjou, a match that further unsettled the Norman nobles. The Angevins were rivals and not well liked by the Norman aristocracy. For English lords, to accept Matilda was also to accept Geoffrey's influence, and that was a bitter prospect. Henry held his throne until his death in 1135. When he died, the kingdom faced the true test of the oaths made years before. The barons were now free from Henry's pressure. Instead of honoring their pledges, many turned to another candidate, Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Stephen had charm, connections, and crucially, he was a man. Within weeks of Henry's death, Stephen had raced across the Channel, secured the support of key nobles and the church, and seized the throne. The betrayal was stark. The same men who had sworn to uphold Matilda's claim now rallied to Stephen. They justified their actions in many ways. That a woman could not rule, that Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou was intolerable, that Stephen had been chosen by God through circumstance. Yet at the heart of it, their actions showed a willingness to abandon solemn oaths when it suited their interests. This turn of events left Matilda in a precarious position. She had been promised the crown by her father, backed by sworn vows, yet now she was forced into conflict to claim what was hers. Her supporters remained loyal in part, but many wavered or defected. What followed was years of civil war, remembered as the Anarchy, when rival factions tore the kingdom apart. The seeds of this conflict lay in that moment when William drowned, when Henry pinned his hopes on his daughter, and when the barons chose to betray their word. The story of this crisis is not only about politics, but also about the fragility of medieval kingship. A single life lost in a shipwreck changed the fate of a nation. A king's will could not control the ambitions of nobles once he was gone. The rigid expectations of gender and power made it impossible for many to accept Matilda, no matter her competence or right. The broken oath, sworn in good faith but cast aside at convenience, reveals the instability of loyalty in a feudal society. As the years dragged on, the realm suffered. Towns were burned, fields destroyed, families torn apart as barons shifted allegiance from Stephen to Matilda and back again. Chroniclers wrote of a land without law, where Christ and his saints slept. The chaos that engulfed England was rooted in that initial betrayal of promise and duty. The drowning of a prince, the determination of a father, and the faithlessness of lords combined to plunge a kingdom into anarchy. When King Henry I died in the year 1135, the fragile order he had worked to build unraveled almost at once. The barons, who had sworn with solemn vows to recognize his daughter Matilda as heir, cast their oaths aside. The throne was seized instead by Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, who acted with startling speed and cunning. His usurpation marked the true beginning of the struggle that history remembers as the Anarchy, a bitter civil war that would consume England for nearly 2 decades. The chaos of these years did not emerge in an instant, but Stephen's coup made open conflict unavoidable, setting the stage for a contest in which loyalty, ambition, and survival were constantly in flux. Stephen's claim to the throne rested on fragile ground. He was the son of Adela, a daughter of William the Conqueror, and though this connection gave him royal blood, it did not outweigh the oath he had sworn to support Matilda. His chance came from circumstance and opportunism. When Henry died suddenly in Normandy, Stephen was quick to act. He crossed the Channel to England ahead of Matilda, secured the treasury in Winchester, and hurried to London, where he won the favor of the citizens. More importantly, he secured the support of the Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury and several key bishops lent legitimacy to his coronation, arguing that the kingdom required a man to lead it, and that Stephen had been chosen through divine providence. The speed with which Stephen moved caught Matilda's supporters off guard. The oaths they had sworn now seemed less binding, especially when backed by the threat of Stephen's armed men. In an age where strength and presence often carried more weight than legality, Stephen's decisive action gave him a crown that by right was not his. Yet from the very start his kingship was fragile. His breach of faith lingered in memory, and his authority rested not on law but on the shifting loyalties of magnates who could just as easily desert him. In the early years of Stephen's reign, the kingdom fractured along lines of personal allegiance. Some barons pledged loyalty to Stephen, attracted by his promises of land, wealth, and favor. Others, cautious or principled, hesitated, unwilling to turn their backs fully on Matilda. Still others played both sides, shifting allegiance when it suited them. This was a dangerous game, for betrayal was common currency in these years, and castles became prizes to be seized or lost at the whim of fortune. The first skirmishes broke out within months of Stephen's coronation. Forces loyal to Matilda in Normandy resisted his claims, while in England, sporadic uprisings challenged his rule. Stephen attempted to consolidate power by rewarding his supporters lavishly, granting them castles and titles. But this generosity weakened him, for it drained the royal treasury and gave dangerous independence to ambitious lords. Soon the kingdom was dotted with strongholds whose loyalty was uncertain, each a potential nest of rebellion. At first Stephen was not without success. He defeated rebel barons in the southwest and managed to hold the capital, London, firmly under his control. His early campaigns projected strength, but cracks began to show. His decision to arrest several bishops in 1139 alienated the Church, which had once been his strongest ally. Without the steady hand of ecclesiastical support, his kingship seemed less divinely sanctioned and more the product of brute force. It was in these unstable conditions that Matilda resolved to stake her claim. For several years after her father's death, she remained in Normandy, gathering support and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. She was not without resources. Her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou gave her a strong base across the Channel, and Geoffrey steadily pressed claims in Normandy, harassing Stephen's forces there. This slow grinding war in France kept Stephen distracted and drained his strength. By the early 1840s, Matilda made her bold move. In the year 1139, she crossed the Channel and landed in England. She was joined by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful and capable lords of the realm. Robert's support was invaluable. He was an experienced commander and a man of influence, and his loyalty to Matilda was firm. With his backing, her claim to the throne could no longer be dismissed as mere words. Matilda's arrival sparked new energy in the conflict. Her supporters rallied, and soon the kingdom was split between two courts, Stephen in the south and east, and Matilda's followers in the west. Towns and castles declared for one side or the other, and loyalties often shifted with the fortunes of battle. The war did not unfold as a series of great set-piece confrontations, but as a grinding series of sieges, raids, and betrayals. Castles were the key to power, and possession of a stronghold could secure a region or open the door to rebellion. In these first years of the Anarchy, Stephen and Matilda clashed repeatedly, but neither could achieve a final victory. In 1141, Stephen marched against Matilda's forces at Lincoln. There, in one of the few decisive battles of the war, he was defeated and captured. For a moment, it seemed as though Matilda's triumph was certain. With Stephen imprisoned, she advanced to London to be crowned. Yet fate once again turned against her. Her proud demeanor and insistence on imperial titles alienated the Londoners, who rose against her before she could secure her coronation. Forced to flee, she lost her chance to consolidate power. Stephen's queen, also named Matilda, rallied his supporters and soon negotiated his release in exchange for Robert of Gloucester, who had been captured. The war dragged on with no end in sight. Year after year, England endured raids, sieges, and shifting alliances. Chroniclers described the suffering of the people, who bore the weight of barons enriching themselves through conflict while law and order collapsed. The phrase "Christ and his saints slept" entered the record as a haunting description of a kingdom without peace. Throughout it all, Matilda showed a resolve that defied expectations. She endured defeats, betrayals, and narrow escapes, yet she refused to abandon her claim. Even when she was driven from London, even when allies faltered, her determination did not waver. She fought not only for her own right, but for the legacy of her father's promise. To her, the betrayal of the barons was not the final word. Legitimacy was on her side, and she would not yield. Her struggle, however, revealed the deep limits placed on her as a woman in a man's world. Her authority was constantly questioned, her behavior scrutinized in ways a king's never would have been. She was condemned as arrogant for insisting on her rights, while men who did the same were praised as strong. Yet her endurance in the face of these obstacles ensured that the conflict remained alive. Without her unyielding will, Stephen's reign might have solidified, and the anarchy might never have taken hold. The opening years of the war, with Stephen's usurpation, the early battles, and Matilda's return, marked the beginning of nearly 20 years of turmoil. The seeds of betrayal that had been sown when the barons broke their oaths now bore their bitter fruit. England became a kingdom without peace, where the throne was contested not by law or right, but by the shifting fortunes of war. The struggle that had begun with Stephen's usurpation did not quickly resolve itself. Instead, it stretched across almost 2 decades, shaping a period remembered as one of the darkest chapters in England's history. This was not a war of sweeping campaigns or decisive victories, but a slow, grinding conflict where castles and sieges defined the rhythm of power. The very fabric of the kingdom was pulled apart, and ordinary people paid the heaviest price while their lords fought and shifted allegiances. What had begun as a contest between Stephen and Matilda became a struggle that engulfed the land itself, leaving England divided and weary. In a feudal world, castles were not only symbols of strength, but the very heart of authority. Whoever held a castle could dominate the surrounding region, tax its people, and protect or harass its neighbors. Because of this, the Civil War became a conflict of stone walls rather than open battlefields. Strongholds were fortified, refortified, and contested again and again. A single siege could drag on for months, draining resources and testing the loyalty of both defenders and attackers. Barons took advantage of the chaos to carve out domains for themselves. Many fortified castles without royal permission, turning them into private fortresses that served their own ambitions rather than those of king or empress. Chroniclers wrote bitterly about these adulterine castles, which sprang up like weeds across the countryside. Each new stronghold was another source of strife, for the lord who built it owed little to either claimant and often switched allegiance when it was to his advantage. The result was a kingdom where loyalty was fragile and constantly shifting. A lord who one year declared for Stephen might the next throw open his gates to Matilda, and then, with the winds of fortune reversed, return to Stephen again. In such an environment, trust became nearly impossible, and oaths were little more than words on parchment. This made the war unpredictable. Even when one side appeared to have gained the upper hand, victory was elusive because allies could not be counted on to remain steadfast. Despite these difficulties, Matilda experienced moments when her fortunes rose dramatically. Her most notable triumph came after the Battle of Lincoln in the year 1141, when Stephen was defeated and taken prisoner. For the first time, her claims seemed within reach. With her rival in chains, she advanced on London with the intention of being crowned queen. The symbolism was powerful. The capital was the heart of the realm, and coronation there would have sealed her authority in the eyes of many. For a short while, it appeared as though she might succeed. Supporters rallied to her side, and the path to Westminster opened before her. Yet Matilda's position was always precarious, dependent on maintaining the goodwill of those who had long resisted her. Her insistence on the dignity of her imperial title, her demands for funds and loyalty, and her unwillingness to soften her authority alienated potential allies. The citizens of London, whose support was vital, turned against her. Whether from resentment of her manner or fear of reprisals from Stephen's remaining supporters, they rose in defiance before she could complete her coronation. Matilda was forced to flee, her moment of triumph cut short by a sudden reversal of fortune. This episode revealed both her strength and her weakness. She had brought her rival to the brink of defeat, yet she could not bridge the gap between legitimacy and acceptance. Her royal blood and her father's designation gave her a rightful claim, but the resistance of her contemporaries to female rule and her own uncompromising demeanor proved barriers she could not fully overcome. Still, the fact that she came so close to being crowned shows the resilience of her cause and the seriousness of her challenge. Another striking episode occurred at Oxford some years later. In 1142, Stephen laid siege to the castle where Matilda had taken refuge. The situation seemed desperate. Surrounded and cut off from supplies, she appeared to be on the verge of capture. Yet in one of the most famous escapes of the period, she managed to slip through Stephen's lines on a snowy winter night. Dressed in white to blend into the snow, she crossed the frozen river and fled to safety. The daring escape became legendary, not only as a testament to her courage, but also as a symbol of her refusal to yield even in the most perilous circumstances. For Stephen, the years of conflict were equally testing. His capture at Lincoln had been a humiliating blow. The image of a king in chains undermined his authority, and his release, secured only through the exchange of Robert of Gloucester, revealed the fragility of his rule. He returned to the throne, but the aura of kingship was tarnished. A ruler who could be captured could just as easily be toppled again, and his rivals took encouragement from this weakness. Stephen's struggle was not only against Matilda, but also against the barons who exploited the turmoil for their own gain. Many of those who had once supported him turned against him when he could not grant enough favors or enforce their obedience. His decision to reward loyal followers with castles and lands strengthened them but weakened the crown, leaving him less able to impose order. The very tools he used to keep support ensured that his authority would remain fragile. Even the church, which had been essential to his initial rise, grew wary of him. His arrest of bishops in 1139 had already strained relations, and his inability to protect ecclesiastical lands from the depredations of barons further alienated clerical leaders. Without strong ecclesiastical backing, his claim to divine legitimacy appeared thin. The conflict between Stephen and Matilda thus became less a battle of armies and more a struggle for endurance. Each had moments of advantage, but neither could secure lasting dominance. Matilda's triumphs at London and Oxford showed her determination and strength, but her inability to secure broad acceptance kept the crown out of her reach. Stephen's capture revealed his vulnerability, yet his resilience and ability to reclaim the throne demonstrated that he was not easily broken. Meanwhile, the kingdom bled. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and trade disrupted. Ordinary people suffered under the constant raids of soldiers who owed allegiance only to their lords and cared little for the peasants they exploited. Chroniclers wrote of widespread misery, describing a land where justice was absent and violence unchecked. The phrase that Christ and his saints slept was not mere exaggeration, but an expression of the despair felt by those caught in the middle of noble rivalries. What made this conflict so destructive was the absence of a clear resolution. Unlike wars where one side eventually triumphs and restores order, the anarchy dragged on with no decisive end in sight. Stephen and Matilda were locked in a stalemate, each too strong to be destroyed, yet too weak to win. The castles that dotted the landscape ensured that even when one side won a battle, resistance continued elsewhere. The lords who shifted allegiances prolonged the uncertainty, ensuring that peace remained out of reach. And yet, through all of this, Matilda remained unshaken in her belief that the crown was hers by right. Her determination, tested at London, proven at Oxford, and reinforced by years of hardship, kept her cause alive. Stephen, too, refused to yield, clinging to his throne despite the blows to his authority. Their personal struggles became the struggles of the kingdom itself, with the land divided as the contest for legitimacy turned into a long, bitter test of will. This was the reality of the anarchy as it unfolded. A kingdom held hostage by castles and sieges, a realm where loyalty was fickle, triumphs were fleeting, and even kings could be captured. It was a time when Matilda's courage shone in moments of defiance, when Stephen's authority faltered and recovered, and when the people of England bore the terrible weight of a war without end. The long years of the anarchy left scars on England that would not heal quickly. What had begun as a contest of succession between Stephen and Matilda became something far greater in its impact, for it reshaped the kingdom's political, social, and even cultural life. The war brought no clear victor in its day, but its legacy was profound. Matilda did not wear the crown she had claimed as her right, yet her struggle transformed the path of English kingship and left her son, Henry, to reap the fruits of her determination. The story of these years is not only one of ambition and betrayal, but of human suffering, endurance, and the slow birth of a new dynasty that would dominate England for centuries. The human cost of nearly 20 years of civil war cannot be overstated. Chroniclers, writing with anguish, described a land undone by the endless conflict. With loyalties divided and authority weakened, England became a patchwork of petty wars. Lords seized the chance to fortify castles without royal approval, building strongholds that they ruled like small kingdoms. Each baron looked after his own power, often at the expense of neighbors and common folk alike. Violence became a way of life, and the people caught in the middle bore the consequences. Raiding parties roamed the countryside, plundering villages and burning crops. Fields went untilled, harvests were destroyed, and famine spread in some areas. Families abandoned their homes in search of safety, while merchants faced robbery on the roads and disruption in the markets. Law was absent in many places, and justice, which should have flowed from the crown, was replaced by the whims of whoever held the nearest castle. People were taxed and retaxed, forced to pay both Stephen's men and Matilda's supporters as control shifted back and forth. For the common villager or townsman, allegiance was meaningless. What mattered was survival. The chronicler of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captured the despair of the age when he wrote that Christ and his saints slept. This phrase was not meant as a casual complaint, but as a lament for a society where the ordinary rhythms of life had broken down. In a Christian world where divine order was expected to underpin human affairs, the absence of peace was felt as a cosmic failure. It seemed to many that God himself had turned his face from England. This sense of abandonment speaks to the depth of suffering endured by those who had no stake in crowns or dynasties, but who paid the price for noble ambition. Amid this turmoil, Matilda remained steadfast, even if her fortunes waxed and waned. Though she never secured the throne for herself, she fought with determination that few could have matched. Her eventual withdrawal from England was not a defeat in the deepest sense, for she had preserved her son's claim and laid the groundwork for a future victory. That future arrived in the person of Henry, the boy she had borne to Geoffrey of Anjou, who grew into a man capable of claiming what his mother could not. Henry came of age during the Anarchy, his character forged by the chaos that surrounded him. He inherited not only the blood of the Norman kings through his mother, but also the restless ambition of the Angevin house through his father. This dual inheritance made him a formidable figure. From his base in Normandy and Anjou, he gathered strength, learning the art of war and the tactics of political alliance. Unlike his mother, he was not burdened by the prejudices against female rule that had crippled her acceptance in England. When his moment came, he would be received as a king without the same resistance that had met Matilda. The decisive shift came late in the conflict, when the endless stalemate had worn down both sides. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could destroy the other, and the kingdom itself was weary of war. In this climate, Henry's emergence offered a way forward. He entered England in the early 1150s, bringing with him not only armed men but the promise of a new beginning. His campaigns were vigorous, showing both skill and daring, and he quickly won recognition as a leader of stature. Stephen, by this time, was aging and weary. The death of his son Eustace in 1153 altered the balance decisively. Eustace had been Stephen's intended heir, and his loss left Stephen with no clear successor strong enough to carry on the fight. For a man who had spent years struggling to hold onto a fragile crown, the death of his son was both a personal tragedy and a political disaster. With Eustace gone, the prospect of reconciliation with Matilda's son became far more plausible. The following year brought the settlement that ended the anarchy. Known as the Treaty of Wallingford, it was an agreement that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but that Henry would succeed him upon his death. This compromise finally brought peace to a land exhausted by nearly 2 decades of war. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry became King of England, inaugurating the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule for more than 3 centuries. Henry's accession marked not only the end of the anarchy, but the beginning of a new age. His reign as Henry II was long and transformative. He restored royal authority, curbing the independence of the barons and dismantling many of the adulterine castles that had sprung up during the war. His reforms in law and administration laid foundations that would shape the English monarchy for generations. In this sense, the chaos of his mother's struggle gave way to a period of rebuilding and consolidation under her son. Yet Henry's success cannot be separated from Matilda's determination. Without her unyielding insistence on her right to the throne, her cause might have withered away in the years after Stephen's usurpation. It was her defiance, her endurance at London and Oxford, her refusal to accept defeat, that kept alive the claim that Henry eventually fulfilled. In a real sense, Henry's crown was won by both of them, even if only he wore it. Matilda's legacy is not measured solely in the dynastic victory of her son. She stands also as a remarkable figure in her own right, a woman who fought for power in a world that resisted her at every turn. In the 12th century, the idea of a female ruler was still alien to many, and Matilda faced resistance not only because of her policies but because of her gender. Her opponents accused her of arrogance for demanding recognition, yet the same traits in a man would have been praised as strength. Her insistence on being addressed as Empress, rather than simply Lady or Queen, was not mere vanity, but a statement of authority in a culture that denied it to women. She endured insults and betrayals, and though she never claimed the crown, she forced her contemporaries to reckon with the possibility of female rule. In this sense, she was ahead of her time. Her struggle foreshadowed later queens, such as her granddaughter Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wielded great influence, and still later Elizabeth I, who would finally rule England as a powerful and undisputed monarch. Matilda did not win in her own day, but she pushed the boundaries of what was imaginable, and that was no small achievement. Her legacy also reshaped ideas of legitimacy and succession. The oaths that the barons swore to her, though broken, set a precedent that inheritance could pass through the female line when necessary. This principle, though resisted, would not vanish, and in later centuries it would resurface as queens like Mary and Elizabeth ascended to the throne. Matilda's claim, though unfulfilled in her lifetime, planted the seeds for future acceptance of female sovereignty. Looking back, the Anarchy was a time of pain and disintegration, but it was also a crucible in which new forms of kingship and new ideas of power were forged. The devastation it caused to the people of England was immense. Entire regions were scarred by warfare, villages destroyed, and countless lives lost to famine, violence, or displacement. Yet from this suffering emerged a stronger monarchy under Henry II, one that learned from the failures of Stephen's reign and sought to prevent such chaos from recurring. Matilda herself spent her later years in Normandy, advising her son and witnessing the consolidation of the dynasty she had fought so hard to secure. She did not die a Queen of England, but she lived to see her son crowned, a vindication of her claim and her struggle. When she passed away in the year 1167, she was buried with the title that mattered most to her. Not Queen, but Empress, a reminder of the authority and dignity she had carried throughout her turbulent life. Her story endures not only as a tale of political conflict, but as a human drama of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. The Anarchy was a time when betrayal and ambition seemed to eclipse honor and justice, yet within it shone the figure of a woman who would not yield. Matilda's crown remained unclaimed, but her kingdom was forever changed. Her son's reign, the Plantagenet dynasty, and the very possibility of queenship in later centuries were all part of her legacy. England emerged from the Anarchy battered but not broken. The scars of 2 decades of strife lingered, yet the kingdom entered a new chapter under Henry II, whose rule was made possible only by his mother's struggle. In the end, Matilda's fight was not in vain. Though she never sat upon the throne, she carved a place in history as one of the most formidable figures of her age, a queen ahead of her time whose unclaimed crown became the foundation for a dynasty and a reimagining of royal authority itself. History often tempts us to ask questions that cannot be answered with certainty, yet they remain irresistible all the same. The story of Matilda is one such case. She never wore the crown she fought so hard to claim, but imagining a world in which she did allows us to glimpse how profoundly the course of English history might have been reshaped. Her legacy already stretches far beyond her own lifetime, but had she secured the throne outright, the echoes would have been even greater. What followed after her time proves the endurance of her struggle, and in our own day her story still resonates, a tale of defiance, resilience, and perseverance that transcends the medieval age. If Matilda had triumphed and been crowned in London in the year 1141, when Stephen was imprisoned and the crown seemed within her grasp, the transformation of English monarchy could have begun almost a century earlier than it did. Her success would have established a precedent for female rule in a realm where queens were expected only to support kings as wives or mothers. The skepticism and outright hostility she encountered were born of a culture unready to accept a woman as sovereign. Had she overcome this resistance and secured the throne in her own right, it would have normalized the idea that women could rule with the same authority as men. Future queens would not have had to battle so fiercely against ingrained prejudice, for the example of Matilda would already have existed. The struggles of later monarchs, such as Mary and Elizabeth, might have been softened by the knowledge that a queen had reigned successfully long before them. A Matilda-led monarchy might also have altered the political balance of the realm. She was known for her sharp intelligence, her unwillingness to compromise, and her insistence on dignity. While these traits earned her the criticism of her contemporaries, they could have made her a formidable ruler had she been given the opportunity. She had been raised in imperial courts, exposed to governance at the highest level, and trained to wield authority. Her reign could have introduced reforms earlier, particularly in law and administration, areas in which her son Henry would later excel. The crown might have emerged from the anarchy stronger rather than weaker, with baronial power checked earlier and adulterine castles suppressed before they spread so widely. It is also possible that her reign would have altered the broader course of European politics. As the widow of a Holy Roman Emperor and the wife of Geoffrey of Anjou, she was tied to powerful continental houses. A stable reign under her might have bound England more closely to these connections, reshaping the balance of power between England and France. Instead of the long struggles that Henry and his sons would later wage to assert their authority in both realms, Matilda might have unified those claims under her own rule, giving England a stronger position in continental affairs decades earlier. Of course, speculation must remain just that. The opposition she faced was real, and even as queen she would have had to contend with barons unwilling to accept her authority and lords determined to pursue their own interests. Yet even allowing for these difficulties, her success would have left an indelible mark on the expectations of monarchy. The notion that England had once been ruled by a queen in her own right would have carried enormous weight, shaping attitudes for centuries. Though she never claimed her crown, Matilda's story endures today because of the way it touches on questions of justice, loyalty, gender, and resilience that still speak to us. In the year 2025, nearly 900 years after she first pressed her claim, her struggle feels strikingly modern in its themes. At its heart, her story is about a woman fighting for recognition in a world that denied her equality. She faced prejudice not because of her ability or her right, but because of her gender. This struggle, while rooted in the 12th century, resonates with audiences today who continue to wrestle with issues of representation, fairness, and the breaking of barriers. Her story is also one of betrayal and broken promises. The oaths sworn to her by the barons, solemn vows made before her father and God, were abandoned when it no longer suited those who swore them. The ease with which loyalty turned to treachery offers a lesson about the fragility of power and the dangers of relying solely on promises without the means to enforce them. In our own time, when trust in leaders and institutions is often tested, the story of Matilda reminds us how much depends on the honor and integrity of those who wield influence. What makes Matilda's story so compelling for modern audiences is not only her failure, but the dignity with which she bore it. She came within reach of the crown, only to be cast out by the hostility of Londoners. She endured sieges, betrayals, and near capture, yet she refused to yield. Her escape from Oxford across the frozen river, disguised in white to blend into the snow, reads almost like legend, but it was a real act of courage by a woman who refused to surrender. These episodes inspire not because they ended in her victory, but because they display an unbreakable will. In an age that often celebrates perseverance as much as success, Matilda stands as a timeless example. In the 21st century, her story has also gained renewed attention because of the increasing interest in forgotten or overlooked women of history. For centuries, Matilda was remembered mostly in relation to her son, Henry II, whose reign overshadowed her own struggles. Yet historians and readers today are eager to recover voices like hers, to see the ways in which women shaped events even when denied the recognition they deserved. In this light, Matilda's tale is not a failure, but a triumph of endurance and influence, for her fight paved the way for the Plantagenet dynasty and established the principle that succession could pass through the female line. Her legacy speaks to the power of perseverance, the ultimate lesson drawn from her long and bitter contest. Though she never sat on the throne, she never abandoned her belief that it was hers by right. She endured setbacks that would have crushed others, yet she pressed on, securing not her own crown but her son's. The fruit of her perseverance was not immediate, but in the long arc of history, it bore more lasting results than a short reign might have. Through Henry, she shaped the destiny of England and left a mark that outlived her. The power of perseverance is a lesson that transcends time. Matilda's struggle shows that victory does not always take the form we expect. She did not claim her crown, but she achieved something greater. She preserved her dynasty, altered the expectations of succession, and inspired future generations. Her story reminds us that perseverance is not simply about winning, but about refusing to be broken, about holding to one's cause even when the world seems against it. In our own time, when challenges often feel insurmountable, her example continues to resonate. Whether viewed as a tale of political struggle, of gender and power, or of sheer human endurance, the life of Matilda offers encouragement that persistence matters, even when immediate success does not come. She may have been denied her crown, but her fight reshaped a kingdom and echoes still in the ways we understand leadership, justice, and resilience. The echoes of her struggle remain beyond the throne she never wore. They lie in the Plantagenet dynasty her son founded, in the later queens who drew upon the precedent she set, and in the enduring fascination her story holds for us today. Empress Matilda stands as a reminder that history is not only made by those who succeed, but also by those who endure, who press forward against impossible odds, and who leave behind a legacy of perseverance that speaks across centuries.